Greetings, YouTube friends. We're here to talk about the astrology of stablecoins. Uranus just made its ingress into the sign of Gemini on April 25th of 2026. My friend KM and I have found multiple correlations to currency transitions associated with Uranus in Gemini. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury rules exchange and trade. We think stablecoins will play a key role in the currency reset architecture. Welcome, KM.
Hi, Margo. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, I'm so excited to unpack our conversation and all the research we've been doing.
Definitely.
Today, we're going to explore the astrology of the Genius Act, the Clarity Act, and the historical correlations to prior currency transitions. Cam, do you want to start with screen sharing? Because you have done some extraordinary research on prior currency transitions.
Yeah, I have a background in history, so I thought it would be interesting to quickly show why Uranus and Gemini is such an important transition point, because that is the period we're in. That's the stablecoin acts that we're going to be talking about later. So I just want to quickly talk about this. We have two prior reserve currencies that we think about a lot. And the first one was the Dutch crown. So I'm going to pull up the founding of the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609. And unfortunately, we don't have a time chart for this. Can you see my chart there?
Yep.
But you can see Uranus is in Gemini at 4 degrees, which is really fascinating. And this ascendant at 14 degrees Gemini is not known, but we also have a lot of planets in Aquarius, which we're going to come back to. So the Bank of Amsterdam was established a few years after the mega corporation was established, the Dutch East Indies Company. So you can look at this, and this didn't have Uranus and Gemini, but it did have Uranus and Taurus. And this is important to think about because there's some transition between Uranus and Taurus to Uranus and Gemini that we want to be tracking. And everyone who knows a little bit about astrology understands that Taurus has to do with money and currency. And so when I first started doing this research, and I think you felt the same, it was surprising to see that the currency transitions or some major moments happened on the Gemini-Sagittarius axis and not the Taurus-Scorpio one. Did you find that interesting too?
I did. And, while you focused on the world history, I focused on the US history and the major currency transitions that have occurred in the US. And I found a very similar pattern. Fascinating correlation to the sign of Gemini with both Uranus and also Saturn.
Yeah, so I want to get there because it's going to be part of this whole story. So we have the Bank of Amsterdam established. That established the Dutch crown as one of the most important reserve currencies for over 100 years. Even though it was the reserve currency, in the middle of that, we see the Bank of England founded about 84 years later when Uranus is back in Gemini in 1694. And look at that. That is the start of what becomes the pound sterling as the reserve currency, but not quite yet. The crown continues to be important until about the time, it's a debate. These things take time, but eventually we have the Bank of Amsterdam having a failure between 1790 and 1791. And at this time, you have Pluto in Aquarius. Uranus has left the building. It's over in Leo at this point, but this is really what led to the transition from the crown to the pound sterling. And there's about a period of 25 years where there wasn't a consistent global reserve currency. And I think this is really important for us to think about because we could be approaching a similar transition where as stablecoins become popular or as a new reserve currency becomes popular, it's not clear. There might be a multimodal opportunity or multipolar situation. But the pound sterling became really the de facto reserve currency after the English defeated the French. And there was, the famous Battle of Waterloo where Napoleon was defeated. I have that over here, but I also have the Congress of Vienna. And this was an event in 1815 that really most historians see the establishment of the pound sterling as the reserve currency for the next 130 years until World War II. And look what we have over here. We have Uranus and Gemini. And that to me is I'm
Uranus
sorry,
is, yeah,
Sagittarius.
yeah,
Thank
on
you.
the axis. Yep.
The opposite sign. And look at this. This is an exact date. We don't have a time, but the sun is in Gemini.
Yeah.
So, there's a reflection there. We also have, a lot of air activation with Jupiter in Libra, Saturn in Aquarius, and that's something that you saw as well. So even though Pluto's in Pisces and Uranus is in the opposite sign, polarities, axes matter a lot. And so before I hand it over to you, I just want to say the final change, which really was when most historians see the US dollar becoming the reserve currency, was the Bretton Woods conference at the end of World War II. And this is back when Uranus is in Gemini. This establishes the US dollar as the reserve currency. The pound sterling was still an important currency. And really interestingly, there were some events into the 1950s that were the final nail in the coffin for the pound sterling. And I raise that because one of the important events happened in 1952, 1953, when we had a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Libra, the opposite sign of the one we just had. But I think this is important. So we know that this is the official establishment of the US dollar as the reserve currency for the world. But I want you to point out when the US started to have some banking influences. And so I'm going to let you share your screen.
Yeah, it's really it's quite profound to see these aspects transits, and specifically certain degrees even of the sign is what I to notice. So let me walk through some of the things that I've been tracking. So the US dollar was formed in 1792. But before the US dollar was formed, I'm just going to throw out some dates and some charts real quick, because eventually this is going to coalesce into a bit of a thesis that I'm working on right now. So the first ever US bond was issued on October 3rd, 1776. So that was in response, obviously, to the Revolutionary War after the United States had declared its independence. And I use this chart in financial astrology with an incredible amount of precision to time cycles in the bond market. But what stands out to me about this, obviously, we all know that, we don't necessarily all know. Let me tell the viewers who are newer to astrology or not astrologers, but the astrologers in the group, many of them know that Uranus was in the sign of Gemini when the United States was founded during the Revolutionary War, and that there is actually a more prominent and discussed cycle for US history that correlates to Uranus in the sign of Gemini with major wars that shaped the history of the United States, starting with the Revolutionary War, moving to the Civil War, and then World War II. And now here we are about to embark on our next 7-year transit of Uranus through the sign of Gemini. And so the first US bond was formed with Uranus at 10 degrees of Gemini. And interestingly, it was conjunct by 1 degree there to Vesta, the asteroid, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. Just interesting to note. So we've got a lot of activity going on around 10 to 13 degrees Gemini is what we're going to start to notice on these charts as they emerge. So, the history of the United States dollar and the currency in the United States went through many iterations. We had the first Bank of the United States and then the second Bank of the United States. And those weren't quite as interesting to me as the National Banking Act, the National Bank Acts. And this was very interesting to me because there are key points that remain today from the National Banking Act. And specifically, what really stands out to me is that the National Bank Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a federally chartered banking system that allowed private national banks to issue standardized banknotes backed by US government bonds. And so this is not the first time that currency was connected to debt or government bonds, but it was the first time that a system of national banks was issuing national bank notes that were secured by US Treasury securities. And why this stands out to me as interesting is because the current stablecoin legislation in the Genius Act and the Clarity, well, the Clarity Act isn't passed, but we're still looking at it because it's like a partner to the Genius Act, which we'll get into as we look more at those currently. But essentially, the Genius Act created a system that backs digital dollars or stable coins with government bonds. And so there's a very clear linkage to the National Bank Acts that took place in 1863 and 1864. So there was two versions. This is version 1, and then there was a version 2 that happened a year later. So you can see that we have Uranus at 16 degrees Gemini for version 1. And then if we head over to version 2, it was a little bit later. We had Uranus at 24 degrees Gemini. And then the nodes, interestingly, were in the Scorpio-Taurus axis there as well. But I'm going to leave the nodes for a conversation for another day.
Can I jump in there real quick,
yeah,
Margo?
Please do.
One interesting thing, people who know U.S. history know that a huge debate in the founding years of the U.S. was about whether there was going to be a nationalized bank. And the U.S. at first saw themselves much more like what we think of the European Union today. The states wanted a lot more autonomy. Famously, there was the Articles of Confederation that failed and led to the Constitution, which wasn't even enacted until 1789, so much further past the original bonds issuance in 1776. But I think it's really interesting, that debate. I mean, literally, like the whole musical, no, I shouldn't say this, but Hamilton is a lot about this. The actual Alexander Hamilton was really concerned about having a national bank. And so you see that bubbling in the early days of the US founding during the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. And then 84 years later, when Uranus returns, you finally get those critical national banking acts that are still in place today, two Uranus and Gemini cycles later. And so I want to focus on this. And I just love that you found this, because the other important banking or monetary component of the US is obviously the Federal Reserve, but it was founded not when Uranus was in Gemini. So when you found this banking act, that to me was the key that unlocked the Gemini component of what we're looking at today. Not that the Federal Reserve is not important, it definitely is, and we want to talk about that, but I wanted to make that point about the debate over having a national banking system at the very start of the country.
Yeah, that is absolutely states' rights, that sort of thing was all like really front and center in the founding of the United States. And so that's a great point. I think the Federal Reserve, if we take a look, it didn't have Uranus in Gemini, but it had Saturn at 13 degrees Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like, we're repeatedly seeing this, middle decan, right? Because you can divide the one astrology sign, which is 30 degrees, into decans, and each one is 10 degrees, right? And so I'm seeing a lot of activation in that second decan of Gemini correlated to major structural shifts. So then we moved forward to the Federal Reserve Act, where money became centralized. Basically, that was the gist of what happened with the Federal Reserve Act. I mean, obviously there's a lot more, but prior to that, states, individual banks could issue currencies, right? And so the Federal Reserve Act was the attempt to centralize the currency. And so now that has what's carried us forward to today, right? And the question then that has come up with the Genius Act and the Clarity Act has been, will individual banks be able to issue their own stable coins? Will this be, in essence, like some sort of way of kind of hearkening back to a time when there were multiple variations of the currency? These are just bigger, broader topics that we can talk about. Yeah, I guess so. So from the Federal Reserve Act, then we moved to Bretton Woods, and you talked about Bretton Woods. So I guess we could just. Do you have anything else you want to unpack?
Yeah,
here?
There's just something funny. I don't know which set of terms or faces you use, but I use the Egyptian terms, which is another way of breaking down the 30 degrees of a zodiac sign even further than the decans. And it's really interesting. About 6 to 12 degrees is Jupiter. So we see a lot of these things happening around 10, 11 when they're starting to expand and grow. And that's fascinating because Jupiter is technically in its detriment in Gemini. And yet the Egyptian terms are ruled. And then after 12 degrees until about 17 degrees, again, it depends. There's different systems, but that middle area in the Egyptian system is ruled by Jupiter and then Venus. And Venus, of course, is the planet of money. And so I just think it's fascinating that that part of Gemini specifically is activated. And then the final terms of Gemini is ruled by Saturn. So that structure, really putting it into place. The third decan of Gemini is ruled by the sun in Chaldean sense. I don't know if you use Chaldean decans, but it's extraordinary how much we kept seeing those middle degrees activated until the system was implemented in the later degrees. And the only thing I'll add to Bretton Woods is this was the conference or the set of acts and rules that led to like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and a lot of the infrastructure that we think of as the post-World War II order that is not only going to be re-examined as Uranus returns, but it's going to be reflected on because at the time, you can see down there, Neptune was at 1 degree Libra. It was in Libra. And now Neptune is halfway across the zodiac in Aries. And so Bretton Woods and the post-World War II order is going to be completely overhauled, reviewed, reflected, reimagined. I think one of the best ways to think of Uranus and Gemini big picture is that there is a division. There's something about the duality of Gemini and the transactional or market nature of it that is really good at splitting things up or organizing things, all those mercurial things or themes that we think about. And now we're going to be doing that again. And so here we are, 84 years later. I've been thinking about Uranus and Gemini for so long. I can't believe we're now here permanently until 2032. And we had a really significant currency act passed last summer with the Genius Act. And then the Clarity Act has been passed by the House, right? And now it's waiting to be reviewed by the Senate. And so let's dive into the astrology of those two. And you could probably offer an even better explanation than me of what those two acts do, but they're core to thinking about the integration of currency in the future on the blockchain in what we call crypto today.
Absolutely. So, and I love the story of actually, we found this chart together. You
Mhm.
remember? We actually went through Donald Trump's signing, we minute by minute, and
We were
found.
watching C-SPAN clips of the actual signing.
Yep. So this, for any of the astrologers in the group who want to grab this date and time, this is the exact moment in time when Donald Trump signed the Genius Act into law. So for that reason, one of the things that's cool about this is that we can actually use, Cam and I like to use the Arabic lots, and specifically the part of fortune is a key piece that I use in financial astrology. So that's going to be accurate because those lots are only going to be accurate if you have the right time of day. So interestingly, we have a 29-degree part of fortune, and that's kind of interesting and fun if we were to put it on Donald Trump's chart. But that's a conversation I think for another.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, I mean, look at that. It just shows more the mathematical power. And also with that midheaven and the part of fortune there, people should know that Jupiter is going to be passing through that next summer, 2027, because Jupiter is going to be in Leo from June 29th of this year through partway through July of 2027. So somehow the Genius Act will be reactivated, expanded upon. And what was really interesting about last summer when this was signed was that was a period of time that looks a lot like 2026. It was a preview of 2026. Saturn and Neptune were in Aries. They didn't make an exact conjunction, but look at how close they are down there. They're less than a degree apart. Uranus was in Gemini right after, I mean, it entered like 10 days before this act was signed, which is incredible. So we're going to be thinking about where this leads us. And I know we don't want to go too deep into the nodes, but I think since that we're going to focus on the astrology of this act and the Clarity Act, I do think it's interesting that this was right after the Mars South Node conjunction or the Mars K2 conjunction. I remember that day because the South Node in Virgo is about a loss of facts or details or processes that used to be really important. And in a mundane sense, letting go of the systems that we use. So to have Mars there, Mars severs, Mars separates. It's the knife in astrology. I just think that is really important to keep your eye on the Genius Act because of that Mars K2 or that Mars South node conjunction.
I agree. And check this out. This is so fascinating. This is the Genius Act on the Federal Reserve chart here. So Federal Reserve on the inner wheel and Genius Act on the outer wheel. So the nodes are almost exactly conjunct. Mars is exactly conjunct the South node on the Federal Reserve chart.
To the degree.
To the degree.
It's incredible.
And just a few arc minutes off. And then very tightly orbed 1 degree orb to the transit South node. And the part of fortune also 6-degree difference. Now, it could be debatable if 602 is the proper time for the Federal Reserve creation. That there are multiple sources that I have found that use that, so that I feel pretty confident in that. But I guess it's more in question because it was a long time ago than the current chart when we're just talking about the part of fortune and the ascendant and descendant. But that is very, very powerful. And then we've got the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, very close to the midheaven of the Federal Reserve. So, and for anybody who hasn't followed my work, I wrote a 2026 forecast, and I've been talking about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction has a correlation to currency reset cycles and debasement cycles as well. So, and these are long running transits. I think this is probably a good time to emphasize what you were talking about earlier. A lot of times when people look at a currency reset or, they think it's going to be like one event, like it's going to happen and like wins the moment. But it's really what both of our research and your deep historical research reveals is that this is something that takes place over years, right?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that's what I was trying to emphasize when going through the Dutch crown transition to the pound sterling. There was a period of 25 years where there wasn't an agreed, obvious de facto reserve currency. And from my research, it seemed like gold and silver were the interim players. So that's interesting to think about. But I really am glad you're bringing up the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because we know that that is the reason we're in this global reset in 2026. It's tearing down what's not working in a dissolution capacity. Neptune dissolves. And one of the things, not only for people who don't know a lot about macro policy or monetary policy, the Federal Reserve sets interest rates in the US, or at least the most important interest rates that drive a lot of monetary policy in the US. That's an oversimplification. If you're really into it, I know that. But I think it's really important to understand that the Federal Reserve is about to go through a dramatic overhaul. And so learning what the Federal Reserve does, learning the importance of interest rates, learning the fact that when the Federal Reserve was not able to lower interest rates below zero in 2008 during the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, they came up with something called quantitative easing, which was a way of providing more currency into the market without lowering the rates, because you can't lower them below zero. I mean, you can, but it's not that effective at a certain point. Or it's difficult to do. And so the reason I'm raising this is that the Federal Reserve continues to have to be innovative and do new policies as we get late into this monetary cycle where there is no foundational reserve currency. There's no gold standard like there was before 1973. There's nothing that's really holding the system together. And when you see the midheaven, the career point, the public reputation of the Federal Reserve being exactly conjunct the Saturn-Neptune conjunction from February, something is going to be reevaluated and possibly dissolved. And when I see the connection further of the Genius Act to the South Node, it seems to me that this is the start of the unraveling of the Federal Reserve, is the Genius Act.
That's really incredible. And, I agree with you on, I love that you're able to weave in all of the macro and the historical context and build the whole picture out. When you were talking about the Fed undergoing, I guess, a transformation, it reminded me of some other research that I'm working on that I was actually thinking about saving for a whole other video, but it's pretty relevant, I think, is the Fed Treasury Accord, which took place in 1951. And I'm just going to go ahead and bring it over anyway. Fascinating to see where are the nodes. 19 degrees Virgo Pisces, right? So here I am. I can't resist talking about the the nodes, but this took place in with 5-degree Cancer Gemini, but that's just a few degrees after exiting Gemini, and really this was set into motion 1 year prior in 1950. Fascinatingly enough, at Uranus at the bending of the nodes, and Uranus at the bending of the nodes is when Uranus is square to the nodes. And we have a Uranus square the nodes event coming up here on June 12th of 2026. And so I'll probably save a lot more of that to unpack into its own video. But essentially what we saw was Uranus in late degrees Gemini at the bending of the nodes, correlating to it was the beginning of the Korean War that set the stage for the Fed Treasury Accord. And so that really has had a big impact on the independence of the Fed, right? And so now we've got Kevin Warsh coming in as the new Fed chair. And there's this talk of potentially a new Fed Treasury Accord, or maybe like an inverse type reaction, like inverting it or reversing it, right? So the Fed would maybe lose some of its independence in the current potential construct. So anyway, the way all of this weaves together is really quite brilliant as we see this sort of thing unfold. But if
it is,
yeah.
Can I just say something about the bending of the nodes? Is Uranus in Gemini is a mutable sign, obviously, but it will only square the nodes when the nodes are in Pisces and Virgo. And so we can definitely get into that more later, but I think when Uranus squares the nodes in June, that could be a big moment for us to see what's happening with the Clarity Act, what's happening with the implementation of the Genius Act. We want to do a check-in there because people who know a little bit about financial astrology know that the 18-year business cycle is tied to the North Node in Aquarius. But before the North Node gets into Aquarius, it's in Pisces, and the South Node is in Virgo. And so there's something about that axis, the Pisces Virgo axis, that says a lot about what's transitioning into a new business cycle low or high. And I just wanted to quickly go back to the Federal Reserve chart. In 2007 and 2008, Saturn was in Virgo, and it was on top of the South Node of the Federal Reserve. It required the Federal Reserve to do something innovative and change the way it looked at it. And from a whole sign perspective, the South Node is in the third house of the Federal Reserve chart. So it's all about the ideas and the way that they're communicated. And Saturn put so much pressure on the Federal Reserve, but it resulted in this new way of approaching monetary policy through quantitative easing that, guess what, has only now been reevaluated when Saturn came into Pisces, the opposite sign. And so when Saturn was in Pisces from March 2023 until February this year, there was a lot of challenge with inflation and reining inflation. And Chairman Powell had to think about what is the role of quantitative easing and how do we approach that in the future. And it's really interesting to me that this always comes up in the Pisces Virgo axis. I think that's a big part of the story because not only does Uranus and Gemini square it, but then the nodes switch into Aquarius Leo, which has a consistent impact on the 18-year business cycle.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to track the behavior of I use the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index for charting US equities as a broad baseline for financial astrology because that's the most history and trading view. And if you take I have charted all the way back to 1900. If you look at the nodes traversing both those signs, it's really the volatility really picks up and begins when the nodes are in the Pisces Virgo axis. And this is because what happens in the financial market might not always be what's happening in the broader economy or even in the business cycle, right? But there's a correlation. And so I definitely see that volatility in the financial markets in the Dow Jones kicks up when you get that ingress into the Virgo Pisces axis and then carries on through the Aquarius Leo axis as well. Yeah. So if we hop back to the Clarity or to the Genius Act.
Yeah, I think we should talk about the Genius Act and the fact that, okay, we this was passed with Uranus at 0 degrees. It's going to have a major impact. Why don't you describe a little bit more, because I know you know it even better than me, about what this act is going to do or what it does. And then we can talk about the Clarity Act. And I think one of the reasons it's interesting to look at the astrology of the Clarity Act, or when it was passed by the House, is the final version of it is going to drive a lot of tickers, whether that's Circle, which owns a large stable coin, or any of the players in that space. And maybe we get into that in a separate video, but I think the Genius to Clarity handoff is really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. They basically just work together. They're two parts of the framework or the bigger picture. So the Genius Act is basically the first federal framework for payment stablecoins, where the Clarity Act is actually an effort to transition the U.S. digital asset market to a defined two-agency regulatory framework. So basically, under the proposed structure in the Clarity Act, the CFTC would assume primary oversight of digital commodities and the spot market infrastructure surrounding them, including exchanges, brokers, dealers, and related activities, such as registration, trading standards, custody, and consumer protection. So, and then at the same time, the SEC will retain authority over digital asset securities, including token offerings that qualify as investment contracts, issuer disclosure requirements, and ongoing reporting obligations, and enforcement of investor protection and anti-fraud rules. So basically, that's a lot of words, but I think the technicality is important to understand that the Clarity Act is setting up the regulatory framework for the Genius Act, which already legalized, if you will, stablecoin payment systems. And so without the Clarity Act, the Genius Act can't really be effectively implemented because the Genius Act regulates the stablecoin issuer and the instrument, but the Clarity Act governs the broader market and establishes the regulatory framework for oversight. So I think that that's why we haven't seen a whole lot, and we haven't seen much unroll yet until we get the Clarity Act passing. And so, yeah, you mentioned earlier that the Clarity Act passed in the House already, but it hasn't yet passed in the Senate and become a law. So that's a real top watch for me right now for
huge.
For a catalyst in, well, the crypto markets as well, although stable coins aren't exactly it's intertwined. It's intertwined with the crypto the crypto markets, but it's not a cryptocurrency per se, right?
And think about this. Yeah. People think of cryptocurrencies as Bitcoin and, Ethereum and meme coins, but really it's the blockchain technology that is at play here, and crypto is the nickname for it. And a stable coin, for those of you who don't know, essentially puts an asset on the blockchain. So it's like trading an ETF. If you've ever traded GLD or any of these ETFs that have proof that they own the underlying asset. So GLD is an ETF. It's a ticker you can buy that has a certain amount of gold in storage. I believe that specific ticker does third-party audits, but it's supposed to be a very safe way to invest in gold without physically owning it. Think of stablecoins as a similar way of owning US dollars or euros, or you could own gold. There are some stablecoins tied to gold. The problem is that it's the wild, wild west right now. There's not the same third-party audits. You don't necessarily have proof that they own what they say. And so a great example is Tether. Tether is one of the largest companies of stablecoins. They have a stablecoin that is USDT, T as in Tom, and it is a company that says we own X amount of treasuries, and we're going to issue X number of coins based on the value of those treasuries. So in other words, the value of this coin is tied to the amount of treasuries that we hold. There's a real value behind this digital coin that you're owning. The problem is there's not a lot of clarity, speaking of Clarity Act, in the whether Tether actually has the treasuries that they say that they have. And that's the problem. And that's the value of the Clarity Act, is it will regulate that and provide evidence, consumer protection that these coins actually have them. Because imagine if it came to light that Tether did not own the amount of treasuries they say they own. That would crash the stablecoin. So now what you think is stable, you think you're owning a US dollar and it's just going to go up and down as the US dollar does vis-a-vis other currencies, suddenly is worthless if the amount of treasuries that Tether says they have aren't there. And so that's why this act is really important. And from an astrology perspective, I think it's really interesting. We're looking at the Genius Act on the screen right now. Saturn and Neptune were retrograde at the time. So retrograde means there's an opportunity for things to be reflected on, for things to be revised, for things to come back around. And we're either going to see this further into Saturn and Neptune in Aries, or maybe there'll be an interesting moment when both station retrograde this summer and there's a reflection. And then there's another part of this chart with Mars in Virgo that I think will be reflected on when Mars retrogrades from Virgo to Leo in 2027. And there's a really important eclipse, the final eclipse in Virgo next February that happens exactly conjunct Mars retrograde in Virgo. And I think if we're not seeing something this summer with the Clarity Act, there's going to be a big review of it then, or we're going to see changes to the Genius Act at that time. But it's really fascinating to see that the birth chart of the Genius Act has some activations coming up in the near future.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And, it's also notable that it passed with Uranus at 0 degrees of Gemini, 28 degrees arc minutes. And since Uranus moves pretty slowly, that helps define the time period. But, Uranus is going to be passing over that degree again. Because since the time, July 18th of 2025, Uranus has gone retrograde and now is correct again, and we'll head back over that degree again. That's going to happen as first the sun squares the nodes on May 25th, and then on June 12th, as Uranus ends up at the squaring of the nodes or the bending of the nodes, Uranus will be at 2 degrees at that time because Uranus is picking up its speed right now. But it's interesting if we take a look at the Clarity Act too. So this is the introduction of the Clarity Act. And I pulled this time stamp off of legislative documents straight from the Library of Congress. So this is very accurate, although we can't ensure that it was the first moment that it was discussed, but this is the first moment that it was recorded. And then we have another moment, which is, let's see, this is just the introduction there. I have another Clarity Act chart, which is, let's pull that up. That is when
the House passed
it. Yeah. So and there's a lot of things that stand out to me about it. I mean, one of the things that stands out to me on the most basic level for both the Genius and the Clarity, for their passages, is that we've got a lot of activation in Cancer as well. And Cancer is interesting because if you look at the United States Declaration of Independence chart or the Sibley chart, you have a stellium of planets in Cancer. And so and then if you look at, and that stands out across a lot of various different things. Like you look at the formation of the New York Stock Exchange, and you have the ascendant position, where the natal, I believe it's Sun. I'd have to pull up all the charts to have the exact degrees. But Cancer is definitely a season when we see activations for things correlated to the United States, to the government, to shifts in policy, even to wars, because Cancer is, rules also over defense of the home, basically. So, excuse me.
Yeah, the natal Jupiter of the US, so the Sibley chart, the chart that a lot of us use from July 4th, 1776, has Jupiter at 5 degrees, pretty close to the Jupiter placement in this chart of the Clarity Act. And in the whole sign system, it is also the 8th house, which, let's see, you have this in the equal sign, but still in the 8th house, right? And so there's a lot to do about shared resources of a country, the financing mechanisms, all of the debt and transactions that we think about that are not just, the individual country's money, but the way in which money is exchanged and transacted. I also like that you point out that Cancer, because this is another long-term thing to think about. A lot of times the reorganization of Uranus and Gemini, the difficult period for the US at least, which was tied to the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, results in some really harmonious changes for the country and the community, the rights of people when Uranus moves into Cancer. And so when Uranus moved into Cancer in the 1700s, you got the Bill of Rights. In the 1800s, that was Reconstruction and the amendments that abolished slavery and gave certain rights, especially the 14th Amendment. And then after the World War II, when Uranus was in Cancer most recently, you saw a lot of expansion of the rights of, and it wasn't the Civil Rights Act, but led to events of the Civil Rights Act, including desegregation and early important court cases. But I think from a monetary perspective, we can also think about how does the money or the systems of money and the banking of the US benefit people, benefit the individuals of the country. And so I know this is like 8 years down the road, but when Uranus crosses that Jupiter in the Sibley chart and then also in the Clarity Act and the Genius Act, we could see the final promise of those bringing money back to the people. And I know there's a lot of fear over these acts because one of the ways in which stable coins could be, difficult or misused is they could provide the government a lot more information about transactions that citizens are doing. It could track a lot for taxes. But I also think it's going to be a way in which we democratize money in this country, or at least democratize it worldwide. And so I'm looking to Uranus and Cancer 8 years from now as maybe when we see the true promise of that. I know that's a long speech about the Uranus and Cancer movement, but I want people to be thinking long term here. We're at the early stages of Uranus and Gemini, and there's a lot of shakeup to happen.
Absolutely. And if you look at when is the midpoint of Uranus transiting through the sign of Gemini, it's 2029.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really, that's also going to be a Shemitah year. And that's a peak period of time in which it's also going to be, we'll be approaching the Jupiter-Saturn opposition as well. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was in 2020, and it's a 20-year cycle. So that will be, the opposition will be in 2030, roughly, give or take. I don't have the exact chart up, but there's going to be a lot of transition points happening around that time. And so as far as financial systems and monetary resets, I think that we are in this for the long haul. Absolutely. And, you're right to bring up the concerns around privacy correlated to stablecoins. I certainly have considered the idea that stablecoins could be a bit of a Trojan horse, if you will, or a way to kind of, I don't want to say sneak because nobody's sneaking anything, but it's just a way to usher in, let's say usher in, right? The digital dollar. And technically speaking, stablecoins are not the digital dollar. They're not, technically speaking, intended, at least at this time, to replace the dollar. However, I think it's very easy to see a world in which that could happen, right? I
just want to give it, go ahead. I want to give a quick example about, for people who don't know a lot about monetary policy or international monetary exchanges, the reason that stablecoins have the ability to shake things up is really more international. Anyone, anywhere could buy a US dollar without government restriction, without going to a bank. Sure, the government that they live in, the country they live in, could restrict it through internet restrictions, but then they just have to travel, buy some dollars on Coinbase or whatever app sells USDC, USDT, and then they suddenly have a hedge against their own currency's debasement. So for instance, the Argentine peso is constantly going through a debasing process. The past 25 years have led to enormous inflation there because of their currency being devalued. Imagine you live in Argentina and you want to protect against that. You buy US dollars on Coinbase easier than you can get money right now. And you now have a way of hedging your own native currency or your own country's currency. And ultimately, that could lead to the US dollar having almost more power as a reserve currency. And this is the core question that kind of gets back into the history I started this video with is, are we leading into a new era of the US dollar that is called something different, but ultimately stronger than ever because everyone uses stable coins to own dollars? Or is it going to change into something so different that transactions change and get disrupted, and it's not even really the US dollar anymore. Or it's not the US dollar at all. Let's say that the Chinese yuan or the euro becomes the reserve currency of choice because it's so easy to buy stable coins of those currencies. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to give an example of like how disruptive this could be in the coming years. And the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, it happens about every 40 years, is happening in Gemini this time. The last one was in 1988. There was a series of them. I think that's what gave birth to the internet. Uranus is disrupting the networks and the structures that connect us as humans. It was in Capricorn then. Now it's going to be in Gemini. I think that it's going to be very disruptive, but that happens at the end of Uranus's transit in 2032. So, a lot to think about as far as, does this lead to the US dollar being even more entrenched and the privacy concerns you were talking about, Margo, or does it completely remove the US dollar from the equation? And I think that's why we have to do a series of these and keep checking in to see how this is developing. But I interrupted your second point. I'm sorry. I just thought
Oh
that was really
no, yeah,
important.
those were great points. That was not an interruption. It was a lovely addition. Um, yeah, I absolutely. Those are all really excellent points. That's one of the functions actually of the stable coin, or the one of the advantages, I guess, of it. And I actually would say I'm in the camp more. I lean more into the camp of thinking that the purpose of the stablecoin architecture and legislation is intended to actually bolster the dollar. And if you
Yeah.
remember, when Donald Trump first took office, he made a statement, and I don't have the exact statement here to refer to, but he said that he was intended to make the dollar stronger through digital dollars, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I think that's the process that we're going through. And then the question is, does it succeed or not, right?
Hmm.
And we don't know that yet. That's yet to come. But I guess all I was saying is, just if you circle back to this privacy issue, is that stable coins do enable features like programmability, traceability, and enforcement capabilities that would include freezing and seizure of money, right? And so those are some of the outcomes that people fear correlated to digital dollars. They're undesirable. I mean, I don't like that. I mean, you can think back to like the COVID crisis, and when they were freezing the bank accounts of the truckers when they were protesting up in Canada, just I guess as a random example. But I mean, I guess in a certain way, though, if you think about it, the government already has the capacity to do that, right? But that is certainly one of the fears, I think, correlated with the digital dollar. And
Yeah.
one of the things we haven't talked about yet that I really want to talk about, and this is going to kind of loop us back to what I talked about in the beginning with bonds, is one of the key parts of the Genius Act is that it requires there to be a backing for the issuers to have a backing. And bonds are one of the assets that can be held as a backing. So it requires a 100% backing, actually, with a list of specified liquid assets, which include dollars, certain kinds of deposits, short-dated treasuries, or treasuries backed by overnight repos, and also money market funds. So it's interesting to think about how this influences the bond market, and how, once again, we have that interplay going on between the currency shift and the bond market. And so when I think about ways to position for the stablecoin shift or transition, bonds are definitely at the top of my list.
Right. I think that's what our part two should be, is how do you position for this? How do you work with this? Because there's some really interesting opportunities and a lot up in the air. I wanted to quickly talk about, though, the idea of the government surveillance and the heavy-handed nature of it, if I can.
Yeah.
Not to just, the bonds is a big part of it. But the good part, in theory, of the Clarity and Genius Act is that exactly what you were saying, that there are hard assets backing up these coins, so you can trust them more. So right now, you're trusting a private company called Tether every time you buy USDT, or Circle when you buy USDC. And you don't have any government protection. And so, on one hand, these acts could be great for providing security, which eventually will make them more widely adopted and usable. I think what's funny, though, if they do have the intention to be able to trace money and make it so that they can have more controls over currency. I think they're actually going to be creating a system that will, in the end, disrupt that goal. Because what they're going to do is they're going to get people they meaning like this act and the banks that create these stable coins will get people very comfortable with using them. But because it's an international system, because the internet ultimately cannot fully be quarantined off. I mean, China, PRC tries its best with the Great Firewall to keep their own internet, but it is incredibly difficult to stop people from accessing internet through VPN and all the different technologies out there. Is it easy if you're a consumer who doesn't know a lot of technology? Maybe not, but really there are ways to bypass government controls. And so where I think the counter argument I have to people who are concerned about the heavy-handed nature, the 1984 consequences of stablecoins, I say, hey, if they become too difficult, people are just going to switch to a different currency because it's that easy to do. And that could be the unraveling of the US dollar. Like right now, I think about the fact that the BRICS countries, which is Russia, China, Brazil, these countries that want to fight US hegemony, want to fight the US dollar, they have tried to create their own currency. And it hasn't been very successful outside of those countries. But what if oil prices get so high and people are so tired of trading them in dollars that they say, hey, buy this stable coin that's based on the BRICS currency and you can get oil a lot cheaper? The adoption would be so fast and it would challenge the US dollar, even though the Clarity Act and the Genius Act have tried to make the US dollar stronger. In reality, they created the infrastructure for stable coins, not necessarily just the infrastructure for US dollar stable coins. Does that make sense? Or am
It
I saying too
does.
many things at the same time?
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that hypothesis. That is very interesting and really fits actually if you think about with the theme of Gemini, right? Because Gemini doesn't move in a straight line. Gemini moves from side to side. So it's like in Chinese astrology, the symbol for the season of Gemini is the snake. And
Hmm.
so you think about how a snake moves, right? So you may think you're getting one thing, but you end up getting another, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, also you can also think about the I guess a snake is tricky, right? That's the theme that goes with Gemini as well, right?
Mercury's known as the
Mercury's the
trickster
trickster.
in
That's right.
astrology. And that's why I'm trying to think these ideas through, because if you look at the astrology, whether it's Saturn Neptune being revaluations, currency resets, Uranus being a reserve currency reset, Uranus and Gemini, to me it seems really difficult to think the US dollar is just going to continue its hegemony completely unchecked over the next 7 years. And so for me, there's two options. One, it transitions into something new, like a stable coin of the US dollar, or the stable coins give birth to a currency that can challenge the US dollar, which does not exist yet. And that is why, again, for people who don't know about macro, it is why the US can borrow so much. We are borrowing well over 100% of our GDP, which we haven't done since World War II. Most other countries would have their credit rating completely devalued if they borrowed as much as we do. But because the whole world borrows in US dollar, we can keep doing so. We have the ability to print our way out of our debt problem. And so the second that that stops working, the second that the US dollar stops being the reserve currency, the US has big problems ahead, which we know it does, for better, for worse, with Uranus and Gemini being a reset, Pluto and Aquarius being a reset for the US. So I'm looking at it astrologically and then trying to think from an economic perspective how this could play out. But I love your trickster comment. That's such a good point about Gemini. You always remind me of that. It's really
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, it is good to keep the perspective that things and I think I've said this in quite a few of my comments lately when I talk about Uranus and Gemini or videos is that I think we can't even almost conceptualize what we're going to see as far as
Yeah.
technological innovations go, and that includes with our currency. We can
Yeah.
hypothesize, and we have it's that studying astrology is a lot like studying history, really, right? Because that's what we're doing. We're looking at the patterns of the planetary cycles and then correlating that to historical patterns. And so we get a significant edge to be able to look at these cycles that we're inside of
Hmm.
and say, okay, well, during these transits, we tend to see these sort of things, but it still can surprise us.
It's going to be very surprising 7 years for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great primer for this, and I'd love for the second part to be thinking about how you hedge, how you work with this, some opportunities. Maybe there will be by the time we record next some changes or progression with the Clarity Act. If any of you are interested, you should be tracking it. Like the other day, it came out of a committee that they were going to remove the ability of stablecoin providers to keep the interest that they got from the treasuries or the assets that they own. And Circle plummeted like 20% after that news came out. And it wasn't even an act that had been signed. It was like news from a committee. So we're going to definitely keep tracking this. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add, though, before we wrap this up.
No, I feel good about wrapping it up. I think just some of the things that I was looking at were like key dates that we could look for
Yeah, let's do
potential
that.
emergence
Yeah.
on. And one of the things that was standing out to me, and one of the dates that's really just got my attention for a lot of reasons, and I'll make a video on it separately, but is just the Uranus at the bending of the nodes, which is June 12th. And so that's this event here. And we can see where that takes place. But, I will say also this is a byproduct of us exploring this together. It makes me wonder if this activation of 19 degrees of Virgo might be really important, because if, contending that this is a major architecture piece to the currency reset, then 19 degrees Virgo is an important point on the Federal Reserve chart. It's an important point on the Genius Act chart, right? Yep, absolutely. And so then interestingly enough, on the Clarity introduction, and this is, like I said, definitely a key moment. I can't guarantee it's the first moment that it was talked about in Congress, but it's the first moment it was recorded. You've got a 19-degree Virgo part of fortune. So you can't make that stuff up. So that's something to keep an eye on, right? Will be for transits over 19 degrees of Virgo. And so, this is a long conversation. We could go on about unpacking dates that we think we could look at for active.
It's interesting to me because Mars is going to station retrograde at 10 Virgo. So it's not going to make it to 19 degrees Virgo. It's going to station in January at 10 degrees. And then it's going to go back through Virgo, the first decan, through Leo. And I think that we should expect some conversation there, but maybe it doesn't get resolved until after the retrograde ends and Mars is finally able to approach 19 degrees, which will be months later, well into 2027, when guess what? Jupiter will be at 29 degrees Leo, the Genius Act important degree. So there's going to be a lot with that Mars retrograde that has a say about this. I also want to point out in the near term, May 14th is a Mercury superior conjunction, what we call a Cazimi, and it's happening pretty close to not only the Uranus degree of the Clarity Act at, let's see, what degree is that? But the Clarity Act introduction itself was almost on a Mercury Cazimi. You can see Mercury there at 7, the Sun at 8. And so even though it's a different sign that this conjunction or Cazimi is happening, I like to look at recurrent cycles where we notice, okay, built into the birth chart of the Clarity Act is a Cazimi. So each Cazimi might say something further about that. And we want to track that, especially because in the introduction chart, Uranus was at 27 Taurus, pretty close to where this Cazimi will be.
Yeah, that is a good observation. It's very close to that Uranus 4-degree orb to the Uranus placement for the Clarity Act. So that's great. That's a great date to put on the radar. And then the Sun square the nodes is another interesting date to put on the radar, and that takes place on the 25th. And
it's off center there, but it's very close.
Sun, because I guess if you just look at on just a cyclical like solar cycle, right? That the act was introduced almost a year ago on May 29th, 2025. So it's going to have its solar return. That would be a fun chart to look at too. Not, I think we're wrapping up now, but Definitely.
Yeah,
Um,
it seems like the nodes in Virgo are really important for this. I think it was that the nodes were about 8 degrees during the eclipses in February and March. Is that
mhm.
correct? And so look at that. The sun in the chart of the Clarity Act introduction is at 8 degrees. So during that eclipse season, that was actually when some news came out about how it was going on in the committee. Yeah, during the eclipse season from February 17th to March 3rd, the nodes were hovering at 8 degrees.
Which
And
one do you want? Do you
so
want to see the Pisces eclipse, the lunar
yeah,
eclipse?
sure. You can look at the Pisces eclipse. And even though the eclipse itself was at
Yeah.
12, you can see the south node was at 8. So the sun of the Clarity Act introduction was squaring the nodes in the sky, or the eclipses were squaring it, since that was the transit. And that was when the information came out about possibly stablecoin providers not being able to provide to keep interest. And that was when Circle crashed, which is really interesting.
It was. That's interesting too. And I know we didn't talk about that, but that's actually a really hot topic that is important to the stablecoin architecture is whether or not the stablecoins will be allowed, or the stablecoin issuers will be allowed to issue, I guess, interest, if you will, right? And that's kind of part of my thesis is I think right now it's written in the Genius Act that the token must maintain stable value and does not offer a payment of yield or interest.
Hmm.
So right now it's written in that that's not allowed. Although it's possible that that could shift, right? But
Yeah, let's watch the bending of the nodes to see what happens there.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, so that opens up a whole nother line of conversation, and we're routing ourselves towards the exit now.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. So we'll talk a lot about the different ways. We've been mentioning Circle and Tether. Tether is a private company, so you can't invest in it publicly right now, but there's a lot of interesting ways to look at investing in the stablecoin infrastructure. So I'd say let's get excited to talk about that part two.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about that in part two. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for stopping by. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And KM, do you want to tell people where to find you?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter, Substack, Patreon at the Weekly Stars. I love discussing all of these mundane macro events, so please join me.
Awesome. You can find me at my website at margoamala.com, on Patreon, or on X, and also on Discord. So all the links will be in the video description below. All right, everybody. Until next time.
Bye, take care.
Bye.